Hello, and welcome to another edition of True Audiophiles. Today we're going to talk a little bit about original pressings versus reissues. There's a lot of controversy out there about what's going to sound better. Well, maybe not so much controversy. A lot of people automatically assume reissues just aren't going to sound as good. So we're going to talk a little bit about that in depth today. My take is this: just like any of these types of topics, there's not really a black or white issue on this. It's really very, very dependent on the reissue. There are a lot of different companies that make reissues. There are a lot of different ways people make reissues, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. So the first thing I want to talk about is reissues that are done by the original label or the label that owns the music rights now. In most of those cases, I have found, in my experience, and this may not be everybody's experience, but in my experience I've tended to find that they don't sound quite as good as the original. Or early pressings anyways, not necessarily just the original pressing. But reissues, especially reissues of old recordings where maybe the master tapes are getting really old and maybe haven't been taken care of appropriately, they're just not sounding as good in my opinion. I think that there are some exceptions, not many that I've seen, but there are some exceptions. When it comes to reissues from, I guess the best way to put it is maybe third-party labels, mainly audiophile labels, this is where it gets a little trickier. In most of the cases that I have seen, there are some exceptions, but most of the cases that I've seen where there are audiophile labels reissuing some product, I have tended to find that they will sound at least as good as the original, and in many cases better. So the question now becomes, who's considered an audiophile label? The audiophile labels, in my opinion, typically are ones that are currently still in business. It's going to be Mobile Fidelity, and it's going to be Analog Productions. Those are the primary ones where I really trust the reissues that they tend to do. Are all of them perfect? No. Are there issues, like pressing issues or other types of issues? Sure, it happens. But I'm just talking about, as a general rule, I have had a hard time saying that reissues from those labels are bad, or not good, or not very close to or better than the original. Some of those labels, the ones I just mentioned specifically, Analog Productions and Mobile Fidelity, are starting to reissue super crazy expensive reissues of albums where they take, or at least this is my take on it, correct me if you think I'm wrong, but they take a little bit more time in preparing the master to cut it to vinyl, and they tend to use better quality vinyl, tend to, and I stress tend to, have better quality control over those pressings from wherever they're being pressed, whether it be from RTI in California or QRP, who Analog Productions owns. I think they're in Kansas, if I'm not mistaken. Those two are typically the better of the pressing plants in the U.S., and they tend to, if given the opportunity to do a really good quality control, tend to do a very good job. Stuff slips through just like anything, and you can go on the internet and search out all this stuff. You know, one of the examples that I've seen is Mobile Fidelity is making a series called The One Step, where this, for example, is the most valuable of all of them because it was the first one that came out, number one, and number two, they limited the edition to 2,500. They found out later that that was probably a bad idea, because a lot more people wanted the editions, more than they anticipated. So they've upped it since then. But because of that, and because that was limited to only 2,500, it's crazy expensive. But some later reissues that they've done, the ones that come to mind are some Bill Evans ones and some Stevie Ray Vaughan ones. I've heard of some mix-ups at I'm assuming the pressing plant at RTI, where they put the wrong labels on or they put the wrong records in some of the boxes. So it happens. I'm not going to sit here and say it just doesn't. It's just the fact of the matter. It's just the reality of the situation. There's just no way around that. Or there's not that there's no way around it. It's a fact of life that you have to deal with. Most companies that you buy those records from, though, should be able to do an exchange for you, and usually are pretty happy to do so. Analog Productions has started doing similar boxes. I actually like their packaging a lot better than on the Mobile Fidelity ones. This is, for example, a semi-rare one as well, Axis Bold as Love. This is the mono pressing done by Analog Productions. It's got a nice wooden spine, a little pull-out piece where all the record and everything else is stored. I really like the packaging. My personal opinion is the surface noise on the Analog Productions ones are a little bit more pronounced, but the sound quality beyond that surface noise is just astounding. So everything that I have from those one steps, and most of the Analog Productions and Mobile Fidelity ones I have experienced when I've been able to compare a first or early pressing to the reissues, sound better. So why is that? Well, I think the biggest reason is the audiophile labels have a much more attention to detail when it comes to the chain that's being used to cut the vinyl. They're also cutting the vinyl specifically for audiophiles, where the original early pressings, especially ones made in the 60s or 70s, they're trying to cater to everybody. And what ends up happening is when you have people with like the cheap little suitcase record players or kids with little record players, they tend to try to make those less dynamic and have less of a range and frequency, so there's no skipping that happens. One very famous situation occurred with a pressing from the 70s, which was Led Zeppelin II, and a very famous or infamous mastering engineer, Rob Ludwig, cut the first pressing of Led Zeppelin II very dynamically and with a lot more frequency range than most records are cut. And the executives, the story goes, the executive had his kid, whether it's a daughter or a son, play the record, and it skipped on their little suitcase record player. So they scrapped those pressings and recut a new one and released those. And now those Rob Ludwig ones are highly sought after by record collectors and audiophiles for being probably the best sounding version of that record. I'll have to say that I also have the Classic Records version, which Classic Records was another audiophile label that went under. They were actually bought out by Analog Productions, but no longer use that name. Their versions of Led Zeppelin II and a lot of the other Led Zeppelin titles are really, really good. And I would say the Led Zeppelin II, I have both the Rob Ludwig and the Classic one. They're pretty close, but the Rob Ludwig definitely beats out the Classic Records one. But another audiophile label to be on the lookout for, which is very good, that's no longer around, is DCC. I think it's Digital Compact Classics or something. I mean, they did a lot of CDs, but they also did some records, and they've done a lot of good things. They've done Sonny Rollins and several other things that just sound great. So if you can get your hands, they did a great Van Halen, the first Van Halen album actually. If you can grab a copy of that on vinyl from DCC, it's amazing. Although there was a reissue that was done, I want to say it's 2014 or 2015, maybe even a little bit earlier than that. It may have been 2008, 2009, but it actually used the same platings from the cut that was done for Classic Records, or I'm sorry, not Classic, but DCC. So if you can find that like I have, it's going to be a lot cheaper than the DCC version, and it's going to sound really good. I can't say it's going to sound exactly the same because I haven't listened to the DCC version except for on CD. I have a copy of it on CD, but not on record. So, but there you have it. That's my take. Bottom line again, my general rule of thumb, but this isn't always the case, is go with audiophile label reissues over major label reissues, because in most cases they will sound really close to as good, if not as good or better than the original pressing. One other prime example of that is an exception to that rule, actually, though, is some of the most recent Beatles reissues, and most specifically the ones that were the mono reissues, the ones that were in a big mono box set, and they've also released them singularly too. Those ones, from everyththing I'm told, sound really, really, really close to the original. They were cut from the analog tapes. They were cut from at Abbey Road Studios by a great engineer that did a lot of extraneous work on it, really worked hard to make sure that they sounded good, and they just sound amazing. And the greatest hits, the red and blue covers of the greatest hits Beatles albums, those ones were done in a similar fashion. Those ones all sound spectacular, and my experience, or not necessarily experience, but the feedback I've heard from people who have both copies, they rival the originals in many ways and are very, very close, and will also in most cases be significantly cheaper. So there you go. I would love to hear your feedback on reissues versus original pressings or early pressings. What's been your experience? Do you like reissues for the sound quality purposes and not necessarily just for maybe the extras that they give you, or do you feel that they're a waste of money, and if you can find the original pressings for close to the same amount of money, they're going to be much more worth your time? Love to hear what you have to say about it. I could probably go on for a lot longer, but I don't want to bore everybody about it. But maybe I'll make a part 2 on this if we get enough viewers of this one. So thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, please subscribe to my channel and hit the alert button so you will know when I release new videos. And I hope to have you viewing some of my stuff later on. Thank you very much.